Yeah, let's be totally frank. There is no Russian invasion of Ukraine today without China's support. Its financial support, its economic support, its industrial support, and its military support.
Rush Doshi, thank you for joining us. Do you mind just telling our viewers a little bit about what you did when you were in government at the NSC?
Sure, I had the privilege of serving on the National Security Council for more than 3 years on the China team, helping to run the China Directorate, ultimately finishing as Deputy Senior Director for China and Taiwan.
While you were in that job, I think the full-scale invasion of Ukraine happened.
That's right.
And so part of what you were doing was looking at China's role in supporting Russia. And what did you look at that maybe hasn't really been reported on in the media?
Well, from the very beginning, China was interested in supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And early on, there were diplomatic interactions between the president and President Xi and Jake Sullivan and the Foreign Affairs Commission director in China to talk about that. And the goal was to help China understand that supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine would backfire for them. We drew some red lines on the kind of support that we found problematic. And I think ultimately China tried not to cross those red lines, but would try to get as close to those lines as possible. The red line was, of course, lethal assistance, and they did everything just short of that, and in many cases may have gone over it.
Does that sort of include support for Russia's industrial base and producing the equipment and weapons that Russia needs to prosecute its war in Ukraine?
Yeah, let's be totally frank. There is no Russian invasion of Ukraine today without China's support. Its financial support, its economic support, its industrial support, and its military support. Even its satellite-based reconnaissance has been relevant for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia simply does not have the ability to sustain the invasion without China.
What are the Chinese learning from Russia's experience in the war in Ukraine, and how can they take what they're learning with them into the future in a potential conflict with their biggest rival, the United States, if that ever happens?
The Chinese are learning a lot from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. On the one hand, they're learning exactly where they'll be with corruption in their own military. They've seen that the Russians initially did not perform well. They want to fix that. Second, they're learning about the future of warfare, what exactly matters in the conflict in the 21st century, where you've seen the proliferation of drones and other technology that wasn't as salient in past conflicts. They're learning more about that. Third, they've learned a lot about the need to sustain your own industrial base and economy. Right now, you could argue the U.S. has learned some of that lesson, but we're slower to adopt that lesson and diffuse it through our military than China. And fourth, they've learned a lot about the importance of winning the information domain. A big part of why Ukraine's been able to rally global support behind it is President Zelensky's ability to use the information domain effectively. China would not like to see Taiwan use the information domain effectively in a conflict about the future of Taiwan.
I mean, it could be argued that the United States has taken all those same lessons out of the war in Ukraine, and the fact that they're distancing themselves from Ukraine right now doesn't really impact their ability to fight a war in the future. Do you think there is something to be gained by sticking with your allies until the end, even if it's purely out of self-interest?
I think if you ask American allies and partners in East Asia, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, many of them want to see the U.S. support Ukraine. They want to see Ukraine be successful in this conflict. And the reason why is very simple. They know that if Russia succeeds, it ushers in a spheres of influence world where great powers dominate their neighborhoods. None of those governments want to see that happen. So right now, the most focused governments on this challenge are some of the ones you would least expect. And at the Munich Security Conference just this last week, you saw allies of the United States in Asia very focused on U.S. support for Ukraine.
Really?
The point is that they see America's ability to stick with Ukraine as a proxy for its ability to stick with allies in East Asia.
Well, these are not small economies and not poor countries. If they feel that strongly about it, they could directly support Ukraine in a bigger way than they have up until now. Is that something that they're considering in your view?
You know, Japan and Korea in particular, even Singapore, they've all done what they can to support Ukraine. The South Koreans have supplied significant amounts of military equipment throughout Europe. I do think you are seeing Asian countries take this very seriously, and you have seen that true really since the beginning of the conflict. The real question for them is, will the U.S. continue to support Ukraine, or will the U.S. change its policy?
Is there self-interest for the United States in staying the course in Ukraine in terms of what they can learn from the Ukrainian experience? Because the two countries that are at the cutting edge of military technology right now in terms of how wars are fought are Ukraine and Russia, because they're the ones doing the fighting.
If you ask me, what is the most important set of American interests here? One is that support for Ukraine does matter to those in Beijing. They are watching to see if the U.S. pulls back from Ukraine because they think if it does, perhaps that means that we won't really be able to support Taiwan, and perhaps therefore it's a good time for Xi Jinping to move forward in the Strait. The second big question is really about the future of the world order. If the norm becomes that great powers can once again use force in their neighborhoods, then the global system, the kind of open rules-based system that many believe has existed since the end of certainly the Cold War, really disappears. I guess the third thing that really is implicated here is the ability of the United States, again, to learn from what is happening in the battlefield and to mobilize and modernize accordingly for future conflicts.
We've learned that the wars can drag out for a long time, and we can't just have a superficial stockpile. We have to have the capacity to produce at large scale. Do we have that? And are we improving that capability?
The U.S. defense industrial base is right now in a pretty poor position. That's been true for a long time. You could argue that we overlearned the lessons of the post-Cold War. We really cut funding for defense industry, and we also didn't properly incentivize competition with the then industry. We didn't really hold defense companies accountable. We often built things that didn't matter or that were too expensive and that couldn't be commercialized. In contrast, Chinese defense industry is extremely robust. China's shipbuilding capacity, more than 200 times U.S. shipbuilding capacity, and you see that kind of scale across the board in sector after sector.
Wow.
The U.S. has a long way to go if the hope is to be able to be as competitive in defense industry as we were in the past.
I think one of the things that Russia learned very painfully in the war in Ukraine is that traditional classic naval forces can't operate the same way that they used to. The Ukrainians very successfully deployed marine drones, which are really inexpensive and can take down ships that are worth tens of millions of dollars. The Russians are increasing their marine sea drone capability. They're building new drones, and their drones look pretty much exactly the same as the ones that China has. And it's not clear who's learning from who. But I think what is clear is that both of those countries have learned from the war in Ukraine, and they're expanding that ability, to deploy marine drones. Is that something that America has learned as well, especially with its, massive navy with these very expensive ships that even the Houthis have proved are vulnerable?
Yeah, I mean, the trend in warfare has been towards greater precision, greater range, greater lethality, and now greater autonomy. And all four of these, when it comes to sea, favor those who want to sink ships rather than those who are on the ships. And what that means for the U.S. is there are lessons for a Taiwan scenario. Remember, China has to cross 100 miles of water to reach Taiwan, but the U.S. also has to cross a lot of water from the West Coast or from Hawaii to get close to Taiwan. And the U.S. will have to learn how to fight an asymmetric conflict using uncrewed systems, cruise missiles, perhaps even ballistic missiles and other long-range fires. China has been focused for a long time on sinking big American ships. The U.S. only recently has gotten back into the game of sinking rival ships and thinking about how to do it. So yes, we have a long way to go, and no doubt the Chinese and Russians are learning from each other, co-evolving, cooperating. Defense industry collaboration between Russia and China is higher today than at any point since probably the 1950s. That is a remarkable fact and a deeply concerning one for American planners.
Should the Trump administration be thinking more about Chinese and Russian cooperation in terms of whether it can outpace American military know-how?
Remember, China is an industrial powerhouse, and that means they can be a military production powerhouse. The Chinese and the Russians combined are formidable, no question. The Russians have significant advantages in military technology. So for me, the big question for the Trump administration isn't just, can you push apart the Russian and Chinese cooperation in defense? That's hard to do. The big question is, can you do anything to close the gap between Chinese production and U.S. production?
The combination of China and Russia is formidable, as you said. Isn't the combination of the United States and its allies also formidable?
Yes.
But that's a relationship that we aren't upkeeping.
That's an important question. And the only way to match China's industrial scale is with American allied scale. If you combine the U.S. and its allies and partners, we're a significant share of global manufacturing. China is close to the U.S. on defense spending, but the U.S. plus its allies and partners are significantly more, maybe twice as much as China on defense spending. So yes, we do outscale them, but that allied scale requires collective action, collective mobilization, and coordination. Right now, that is hard for the Trump administration to do, as it talks about potentially invading Greenland and putting huge tariffs on our allies.
So that's counterproductive.
Yeah.
So it's clear that Russia's success in Ukraine is important for China. And the United States commitment needs to step up in order to be able to match that.
China knows Russia is its only great power friend. If Russia goes down, it has no real friends on the international stage at that level. If President Putin goes down, there's no question that there will be debate in China whether or not President Xi and his model really have longevity. I mean, Putin's survival has implications for Xi's own political legitimacy and endurance. And finally, we can't forget the fact that China sees advantage in the US and particularly Europe being tied up on Ukraine. That means they can't focus as much attention on Asia. All of that benefits Beijing.
Rush Doshi, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.